This episode of Skirmish Supremacy is brought to you by Reformation Brewery, the official beer of your game night.
And give it a second, and it says we're live. All right.
Okay. Good.
Excellent. So now we can let the shenanigans begin. Know any good fart jokes? All right. Good evening, folks. This is Nick. Tim will not be joining us tonight. He has gone off to the land of the big mouse and the paid furries, so you know he's going to have a lot of fun there. He's off with some family in Disney World down in Florida, so we wish him the best, and hopefully he doesn't assault any more people that are dressed up in an animal-like costume. So I have with me, David Saunders from Megalith Games, and he's here to talk about Godslayer. Welcome, David.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. So one of the notes I'll say is it is 1 a.m. there in the UK, and for some reason I totally had in my mind as I was talking and setting this up with David that he was based in Utah. I'm really not sure where that was, but then I noticed today and yesterday that all his emails said .co.uk. I was like, okay. So thank you for foregoing sleep to come on to the podcast.
Not a problem.
The listeners do appreciate it.
Always happy to sacrifice sleep for gaming.
Well, I believe that actually resonates with a whole lot of people that listen to this show. Because there's plenty of us that do on far too regular of a basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm located in UK, not far from Nottingham, which is where all the gaming business is.
Excellent. Actually, kind of speaking in Nottingham and stuff like that, I saw a picture posted in a 40K Facebook group, and it was this. One of the members was like, I ran into Duncan today. I was in this coffee shop this tea shop, getting a tea, and here he was. And so had a picture with them together. I was like, that's kind of neat. And I'm just kind of thinking on the other side. He must have been like, well, this is kind of neat. I never get stopped, or Or he's like, yes, I made it. Random people are stopping me in, busy locations.
Yeah.
All right. So you have a god. You have a god. No, you have a game named Godslayer, and
that's right.
It looks like, and I've done a little bit of reading, but it's a mashup of a lot of different. Mythologies and belief systems kind of all put together and kind of personified.
That's right. It's essentially a Bronze Age skirmish game, which functions perfectly at squad level or also at micro skirmish level. And the background is low fantasy, sword and sandals, Bronze Age gaming. I wanted to steer well away from the high fantasy because that's just, everybody does high fantasy, and it's just doesn't interest me at all.
So by the definition that you're giving right now, and the one I kind of read earlier, by low fantasy, you mean kind of lower technology levels, older time period, like you said, more like Bronze Age and stuff like that, not necessarily low amounts of magic? Or is it low amounts of magic as well?
Well, low fantasy would be... I'll tell you some books that would fall into low fantasy category. That would be Thieves' World, Conan, John Carter of Mars. These kind of books. It's much less. You generally don't have elves and things like that.
Right. Okay. So it is low magic, especially when you say like Conan, or not necessarily even low magic as much as magic is, far more difficult to use or control. Summon and things like that. You had I'm thinking the first Conan the Barbarian movie, where the guy sat there all night humming to himself, casting his spell.
Right. Yeah. Magic is not a major part of the game. It is part of the game, but it doesn't play a big role.
Okay. So, that's, it's fun and does make for a different world, because we are used to a lot of high fantasy worlds. So you also just mentioned that you called it a skirmish and then ultra small skirmish.
Yeah, you can play it with 2 or 3 models. It functions perfectly at that level because it's really detailed, but it's also designed primarily for use at squad level. So we're talking like 10 to 50 miniatures per side on average.
Okay. All right. So 10 to 50 miniatures, or a very small war band.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, 10 to 50, that's quite the jump. Yeah, I'm guessing that's broken up into units.
Yeah, that's right. There are warlords, characters, monsters, war machines, and units. So units typically have between 5 and 10 models in them. And you can have a typical warband would have a warlord, a couple of characters, maybe a monster, or perhaps a war machine, and a couple of units as well.
Okay. So what is the difference between a warlord and a character?
Warlord has certain capabilities which allows him to lead the warband. He can assign action points to other models and units on the table. He has a lot of abilities and skills which allow him to buff units and other models. And he's also generally the highest point model on the board.
All right, and so how does that differ? So that's the warlord. How does that differ from a character? What is a character's role?
So characters are a bit lower level. They also can be useful for buffing other models and units. So I'll give you an example. The Halodines, which is one faction we have, one warlord we have is the Oracle. She's the best spellcaster in the game. We also have a character who's a priestess. So she's also a spellcaster, but at a much lower level. So it's all about capability, and the Oracle is more designed for leading the warband, and the priestess is designed for buffing units and other models and direct attack magic. Characters are able to run around the board and act independently. They're good for strategic objective claiming. There are characters who are really good fighters, but there are also other characters who are designed specifically for buffing units.
Okay. So they can they're the Swiss Army, knives of your force. You can use them for a lot of different things.
Mhm.
So can characters, or even the warlord for that matter, join units of soldiers? Join them and leave them as needed, or are they strictly independent models?
They are strictly independent. There is a rule, which some of them have, which allows them to act simultaneously with units. So that's essentially joining a unit, but not exactly, yeah.
So if they, are acting simultaneously with the unit, the first thought that comes to me is a lot like how in Saga you can have your warlord that basically looks at his guys, or looks at a unit of guys and says, "Hey, come with me," and they go with him. They can act with him. He, like you said, he's not really joined, but they're there. One of the things that can happen, as long as they stay within range, they basically can take hits. They're diving in front of somebody trying to hit the warlord. Can all those abilities happen when a character has that ability, or is it more like he's like, "Hey, follow me, we're gonna go charge that hill and die a glorious death, but you know what, we're gonna win it."
Okay, yeah, it's more like the second version.
Awesome.
So, the way it works is one round consists of different turns. I have a turn, you have a turn, I have a turn, you have a turn, I have a turn, you have a turn. In one turn, you can activate a single model, a single unit, or two individual models, or an individual model and a unit. So some you can then, for example, activate a warlord or a character, buff the unit, and then activate the unit, and then the unit does charges or does something, and then play goes over to the other person. So there are characters and warlords who are designed to additionally activate on top of the usual activation limit, and that simulates them joining that unit.
Okay. All right. And so what kind of system is the game based on?
So the essential game mechanics are 2d6 for combat resolution. So I would roll 2d6 plus my melee skill and try to beat your defense. Then if I hit, then I roll 2d6 plus my strength or power against your armor. And any points that are above that count as damage. And they go through and they're deducted from your life points. So, for example, I hit, I have an axe with a power of 4. I roll 6, so I have a total of 10. Let's say you have an armor of 7, so we deduct 7 from the 10, and you suffer 3 points of damage then.
Okay. All right.
Unlike a lot of skirmish games, every model in Godslayer has more than one life point. So typically the lowest level models have about 5 life points, and that goes up to about 15 to 20 for a warlord. Monsters can have up to 40 or so.
Oh wow, that's definitely a jump there. I'm guessing you don't mean monsters just by what is it, the beast race that I was looking at, beast spawn.
No. Every faction has its own creatures. So, for example, the Haladines are the Greek-style faction. They have a Cerberus as a creature. That's one of their monsters. And so the fact that all models have multiple life points means that each of them is more valuable. They're not expendable. And it does require a little bit of tracking of the life points, but that's very easy because they're all tracked on the profile card, and you just mark off the life point boxes as the model suffers damage.
So how does that work with a unit for tracking the life points on the card and all that?
Yeah, it's very simple. The unit has a number of models, so it has a one row of boxes for each model. And when that model suffers damage, you mark off the boxes in that row, and when it's all marked off, then that model is dead.
Okay. And with that, the question that I was thinking of when you started saying that is the fact that if you have the set number, can you increase or decrease the size of a squad? I know you said that they vary from 5 to 10 in size.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something optional to you, or is that this unit is set at this size?
Yeah, basically every unit has a core number of troops, typically 4, 5, or 6, and you can add then a certain number of extra models to the unit up to a certain maximum. So, for example, hoplites, they have a minimum of 6 troops, and you can fill that up to 10.
Okay.
And in a typical game, you could field 4 units of hoplites, so you could put 40 hoplites on the table if you want.
Gotcha.
So we got the 2d6 system, which is pretty common to a lot of skirmish games. It's advantageous because it has a probability bell curve, much more predictable than simple 1d6. It allows a larger range of statistics. And then the next major game mechanic is the action points or action tokens. Now, each model and unit has a certain number of action tokens, generally 4 for standard, 5 for better, and 6 for very good models like warlords. And the number of action tokens you have determines how many actions you can take in a turn. So everything you do in the game costs the model a certain number of action tokens. So a simple attack would cost normally 2 action tokens. Casting a spell could cost 1, 2, or 3 action tokens. Moving once costs you 1 action token. A heavy attack costs 3 action tokens. And there are various tactics which have different number of action tokens. So this enables us to regulate the game very accurately. And it also allows tremendous flexibility because in Godslayer there are no phases. You can do any action in any sequence you want, essentially. So you could move, shoot, move again, or you could move, attack, and then make a second attack, or move, attack, move, use a tactic, make an attack. It's really very, very flexible. And I think that's one of the strengths of the game. It makes it very realistic in that sense. And because it's all regulated by action tokens, it's completely simple and hassle-free. So that's the action token system.
All right. That is kind of unique because you don't usually see a lot of games have, especially skirmish level games, have multiple actions for hero units and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That is definitely a unique thing.
So here's kind of a typical scenario you have. Hoplites, they're ideally defensive unit. They move up, they move once, move again, then they activate their phalanx tactic, costing an action token. Then they reserve whatever they didn't use in action tokens, go in reserve in case somebody attacks them. Because even though their turn has finished, if somebody attacks them and they have action tokens left over, they can make a counterattack. And this is a very important strategic aspect of the game too. So you can put units in a tempting position for a charge to be charged, and leave them with all their action tokens, and then they can fight back very effectively once they're charged.
Awesome. I definitely like that mechanic, being able to, not just strike back, but actually having the ability to, and it sounds at least like, use some of my own special abilities for that unit to really fight.
That's right. So, for example, you moved up your hoplites, you put them in phalanx. This gives them an additional bonus, defensive bonus. So when they are attacked, it's very difficult for the enemies to strike them. Then they hit back with an attack using their leftover action tokens. So those are two of the three key game mechanics: the 2d6, the action tokens, and the third one is the turnaround sequence. So in a lot of games, one player goes first and activates his entire army or warband and does everything with it, while the other person goes off and drinks a coffee. Then he comes back and activates his whole warband or army, and then it goes over to the other player. Godslayer is not like that at all. It's I activate a unit, you activate a unit, I activate a model, you activate a model or unit, and it goes back and forth like that. And when I activate a unit or model, I do everything for that model. And then play goes over to you, and you activate and do everything with your model or unit. So this creates a situation where the tactical setup on the board is constantly in flux, and you have to think ahead. It's much more like chess. So because you don't know exactly what the other player is going to do, and whatever they do is very likely going to change the tactical situation in front of you. It keeps people more engaged in the game and makes it more exciting, in my opinion.
It definitely can. I do like alternating activations in games. It's especially valuable because sometimes there's just that if they activate everything, especially in something that is a smaller level game, you can totally get devastated before you even have a chance to really do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that one definitely sucks when something like that happens.
Yeah.
Tim and I actually we recently were trying to film our first video of Dust 1947, and we'd both been kind of going through the rules and whatnot, and we got to playing, and there was a thought that twinged through my head, but it didn't really formulate like it should have. But it was saying, hey, this is actually a alternating activation game. But, instead of doing that, we just moved all our stuff at the same time. He moved his stuff, then I moved mine. And, the game didn't flow badly, mostly because we only had 2 units each for that first game. And we were just, yeah. But afterwards, I was just like, there's something odd with that. And when we were talking to someone else, they're like, oh yeah, no, you alternate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in a larger game of Dust, that really would have mattered. Where we just had 2 units, totally forgivable because there's not as much likelihood of mass devastation from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Godslayer is designed to avoid any kind of situation like that. This is something that really was important to me in the game design, that units and warbands cannot just get wiped out. I mean, there can be strong effects, for sure, but you're usually going to suffer something very heavy in return. So when I charge a unit which has its full action tokens in reserve, I attack it, but it can attack me back, and it can attack back sometimes 2 or 3 times. So if you're really clever, you can hit a unit, you can charge a unit when it's already expended all its action tokens, and then you're not going to suffer much damage back. So it's really tactical in that aspect.
Okay. So one other thought is there rules for things like first strike, so you're going to hit first, or not even just rules but abilities or anything like that, versus acting at the same time, so if I charge this unit, and I charge, I hit them, I get a bunch of kills, do they get to fight me back at their full strength before they take the casualties, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the majority of combat is simultaneous in Godslayer. That means probably about 95%. We have strike rank system. Most models have the same strike rank, meaning that, and when models have the same strike rank, combat is simultaneous. So my hoplites are charged by Banebrood mongrels. The mongrels make their attacks. My hoplites make counterattacks, and all of these attacks are simultaneous. Then you remove the models from both sides. There are models which have a higher strike rank, and in that case, they go first and the casualties are removed, and then the defenders can make their counterattacks. And there are of course, tactics and abilities which allow models and units to increase their strike rank. So that's part of the game, yeah. But we wanted the majority of the combat to be simultaneous.
Right. Makes definite sense. So how does it work when you go down to, say, a small skirmish game of 4 to 5 models? Is that just normally something along the lines of characters, or?
Yeah. At the moment, that's how it works. You would just take characters or a very minimal unit of 3 or 4 models and plus a warlord, or you could take, for example, a warlord, a couple of characters, and a creature. With that you could definitely play a mini skirmish game. So yeah, and the rules function perfectly at that level as well.
Okay. And what is the normal play area?
So it's the typical 4x4.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And to just about dive into some of the lore and stuff like that, because I totally meant to ask you some of it to begin with, but just before I hop gears over to there, The question just ran away. Damn it! All right, never mind. Let's talk about the world a little bit. And the question will come back to me in like 30 seconds while you're in the middle of something.
Yeah, that's how it works. Yeah. So, unlike a lot of games, this is not steampunk. This is not high fantasy Middle Ages with plate mail armor and knights running around fighting elves. There's nothing to do with that. This is a Bronze Age world. So that means Greek, Roman, Persian, Celtic, German barbarian, that style of game. Their armor is, of course, common for some of the factions, but it's a completely different world to a middle-age style fantasy game. And that's basically a matter of taste. Some people love their high fantasy, can't get enough of it, but that's not really my kind of game. So right. I designed Godslayer to emulate classical and ancient cultures like Rome, Greece, Persia, Celtic kingdoms, and there's also 2 fantasy factions. But yeah, we'll get into that next probably. So the world is a fantasy world, but it's very strongly similar to ancient history and mythology. I mean, it feels like a real world. The factions are designed so that they resonate like a real culture. And that was important to me too. If I'm going to be playing a game, for me it's important that the faction feels real. So that's why the factions were designed in quite exacting detail.
Okay. So, what about the factions? Can you give me a rundown of them?
Mm-hmm. So first we have Banebrood. These are each faction, I should say, from the beginning has either 2 or 3 sub-factions. Now the sub-factions function together, and you could take a warband which is exclusively one sub-faction, but typically it makes sense to combine the sub-factions. Now, there is an advantage if you take more models from one sub-faction, because the warlord has a sub-faction ability, and any model who's from the same sub-faction can use that sub-faction ability. So, in general, you will find that most players will build a warband based around a sub-faction and then add a few models from the other sub-factions. So let's look at Banebrood. Banebrood is the one of the darker factions. They have 2 sub-factions. One is Beast Spawn. These are beasts. And the second sub-faction of Banebrood is Reavers. And they're essentially barbarians modeled on ancient German barbarians. So the Beast Spawn are very fast on attack, very offensive, but they don't usually have a lot of armor. They are one of the fastest, probably the fastest faction in the game. And they're essentially combat, melee, fighting, fast, get in fast and hit a lot of times, but they're not so resilient as some other factions. Reavers sub-faction, that's quite a flexible sub-faction. I mean, they're also melee-based very heavily. They have mutations. So with Banebrood, beast spawn. They have plagues and mutation magic. This is something that makes them a bit more interesting than just dumb brutes running across the table. You can buff them and make them a lot stronger using mutation magic to give them longer legs, stronger arms, better sight, etc. You can also give them plagues so that when they are attacking enemies, they cause different effects on the enemies, like knockdown or additional damage or other things like that. Reavers are cannibals. That's one of the cool things about them. So some of them can just surround a model and just eat it alive instead of making a regular attack. So if, for example, the Reavers are attacking somebody with a lot of armor, instead of making regular attacks, they'll just swamp the guy, drag him down to the ground, and just eat him alive.
That's one way to take care of that problem.
Yeah. So that's the Bane Brood, and they're all psychically connected to a metaphysical dark force called the Urgast, which is a primal force of nature which kind of infects them and causes them to be very violent. And their purpose, their drive, is to destroy civilizations and bring humanity back to a kind of more nature-based civilization, the law of the jungle, basically.
Interesting. And I'm clicking through the shop right now, looking at the different Bane Brood models and all that, and I can't help but notice the standing Ursapine model.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to say that it kind of looks like Sonic the Hedgehog after like a 6-week bender.
It's a little bit cuddly. Yeah, this is one of our earliest models, and a lot of people, you either love this model or you hate it. And we have actually now sculpted an alternate for that model, so one which is a bit more ferocious looking. But a lot of people absolutely love that model and will always keep it. And it's solid metal, and it stands about probably 5 inches tall. So it's you don't want to drop it on your foot.
No. 5 inches tall. That's quite the model. You know, I'm looking around on my desk, which has a lot of models on it, and I'm like, I don't even think I have one that's 5 inches tall.
Okay, let's say 4 inches. 4 inches, probably more accurate. Anyway, Ursapine is a combination of porcupine and bear. Very
and I did mean to allude to that after a minute. It looks like it looks like a porcupine with bear fur and then long hairs on the top of his head that look more like semi-soft porcupine quills.
Mm-hmm.
For those who haven't seen it, once you do see it, I'm pretty sure that you will fall in love with this thing too, because it's just an awesome looking little model. Actually, I mean, you know, most of the line that I've looked at, I do like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's all sorts of different things in here that are pretty awesome looking. I definitely like the Minotaur style miniatures and all that.
Mm-hmm. So the beast spawn of the Bane Brood, they are made up of models which have different beast heads. So we got, and this will be expanded in future releases. So models with bull head, models with wolf head, bison head, boar head, ram head, and each of these different breeds has a certain type of characteristics. Then you got the mongrels, which are a dirty, bastardized mix of the various different true breeds.
Okay.
They're the scum that are kind of outcasts.
All right.
So that's Banebrood faction. Next one is Haladines, and there are ancient Greeks. So Haladines have 3 subfactions. First one is city-states, second one is temples, and the third one is Amazons. City-states is, as it sounds, classic city-state Greek. Greeks, they have hoplites, they have also hill ogres. They're allied tribes of ogres from the hills and mountains around the Haladine lands. And the city-states subfaction is melee based. It's quite defensive. They have good defensive skills, a lot of armor, quite tactical as well. Then we have the temple subfaction. These guys represent the religions of the Haladines. So there are 12 primary gods, and each one has its own priestess, each one has its own magic, and its own temple warriors. So first release of the temple subfaction was the temple warriors for the god of war, the sons of war. But there will be other temple warriors coming in Wave 2. They're the best. Temple subfaction is the best magic faction in the game. They have the strongest magic, most spells. The Oracle is the warlord for that subfaction.
Okay.
The third subfaction is Amazons, and they're a fast attack cavalry subfaction.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, just flipping through here, and yeah, you can definitely get the ancient Greeks feel from this set, and once again, they're some really cool looking units. I do appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. So like all of the factions, they have creatures as well. They have the Cerberus, and they have the animated statue. Haladines are a pretty tactical faction. I would say mid-complexity to use. Most of the factions have a similar complexity level, but there is one which is slightly harder to use and one which is slightly easier to use. But the Haladines sit squarely in the middle.
Okay, so nice mix of different abilities with them to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Each of the factions or sub-factions has a focus, but we didn't want to make it so that you have to play them in a certain way every time. Each one has different options. So, for example, if you take Nordgard, which is our kind of Vikings and dwarves faction, you don't have to play them like classic dwarves, sit around and wait to get charged. You can play them with a hammer and anvil style, or you can play them with a fast attack style if you take less dwarves and more human. So So every faction and every sub-faction has different potential styles of play. But again, they do have a classic focus as well. So the next faction is the Mortons. Mortons are like Romans, but they're a very dark version of Romans.
All right.
The Mortons are an empire, and they have 3 sub-factions. The first one is the Legions. Second one is the Technostratum, and the third one is the Magistratum. Now, Legions, this is classic Roman legionnaires, support characters. It's a tanky kind of sub-faction. So when they go into Testudo, there's not a lot that can damage them. You have to hit them with really high-powered stuff. But, of course, they can't do much when they're in Testudo.
Right. You're kind of locked into all your shields being together and all that. So
yeah, they don't have a lot of power. I mean, their attacks are quite low power. Gladius doesn't have a lot of power. They're a little bit slow, tanky, very melee based. So now there are additional units and models coming in Wave 2 which expands on that. But for Wave 1, it's kind of a tanky sub-faction. They're good fighters. They have good morale, good tactics and abilities. Then the second sub-faction, the Magistratum. Well, okay, this is part of the Morton culture. They are deeply into death and necromancy. So the Magistratum is led by necromancers who are able to raise undead legionnaires. So if a legion has failed the empire, they can be ritually executed and reanimated as Legio Mortem. Or, the necromancers, when necessary, they can raise the dead on the battlefield. So when you're a Morton soldier, you serve several times. You serve out your life, and then you serve again in death.
You can serve the Empire twice.
Yeah. This is kind of classical undead style faction. The troops are rubbish. The skeletons, the Legio Mortem, they're very weak and slow on their own, but the necromancers are very effective buffers and can turn them into really a nightmare. And of course, there's a lot of them. They're cheap. So key to defeating this sub-faction is to take out the necromancers and the warlord. But that's easier said than done. Now, they also have a massive undead construct creature called the Moloch, which gives them serious hitting power. And there's, of course, more stuff on the way in Wave 2.
Right.
Then third sub-faction is the Technostratum. So in the Morton culture, they have kind of a dual magic and technology focus. So the Magistratum represent the necromantic side, and the Technostratum use technology in a rather dark way to further the ends of the empire. Now, in practical terms, that means devastating war machines. It means using poison, acid, gas, fire, tar, everything mechanical and chemical that's nasty.
All right.
At the moment, they have two really cool war machines. One of them is the Scorpio, which can take out high point models at a distance. It is quite scary to go up against. And then they have the Cataclysm Catapult, which is that's designed for taking out units. It's got template attacks with different nasty effects. And they've got a unit called the Zisteri Bombers. They use this kind of Zisteri Cup. I guess you know the game. I think it's Highlight. They play it a lot in Florida. They have this cup where they throw the ball. They have a weapon similar to that, and they throw explosives with these cups. So they're Zisteri bombers, and they can throw smoke bombs as well and hide themselves. So Mortons is a faction which really does well with mixing the sub-factions. So legions backed up by ranks of Scorpios and catapults launching devastation from behind. Then, that's pretty much the Mortons. The fourth sub-faction is Nordgard. These are the Vikings of Godslayer. And they include human Vikings, dwarven-style Vikings, and ogres, and some giants as well. Now, in Godslayer, ogres and humans are cousin races. They were both created by the gods to complement each other. Each has different advantages and disadvantages. So it's common in all of the cultures, most of the cultures in Godslayer, that the ogres and humans live together or live close by and cooperate closely. And they develop the same culture. So you have Haladines have humans, so Greek humans, and then they have Greek-style ogres as well. The Nordgard have Viking humans and Viking ogres. The wild folk have Celtic humans and Celtic ogres.
Okay.
They're essentially cousin races. Ogres are not some monster type of guys. So in Nordgard, you got three sub-factions. First one is clans. That's a dwarven sub-faction who represent the different clans of the Nordgard lands, and they're generally kind of in the countryside, the villages, small towns, as opposed to the clans subfaction, which represents the more city-style dwarves and different kind of brotherhoods. So clan subfaction has the typical warriors called the Fjell warriors. These are dwarves who are militia. They're essentially farmers who, when they're called up, grab their axes and run to battle. They've got also different creatures as well. They're a melee subfaction, classic dwarves, but with a real Viking touch. So next one is guild subfaction. These are also largely dwarves, Viking dwarves, and they have different brotherhoods and guilds which they are part of. So, for example, we have the Einherjar, which is a brotherhood of elite warriors. We have the Fimble Toughborns, which is a guild of explorers. And these guys are armed with crossbow, and they're kind of ranger dwarves. They've also got, buffing characters and creatures. The third subfaction is the Scanfeared. Scanfeared have the human Vikings and the ogre Vikings. Now, all three subfactions of the Nordgard are, quite explicitly melee troops. But of course, the humans are faster. They've also got these giant wolves called Vargs, who are very fast. There are giants called different. There's actually several different types of giants, and there's more coming in Wave 2, and ogres as well. So you're not forced to play only dwarves. You could play only dwarves if you want, or you could play only humans, or you can combine them.
All right. So, and actually, I didn't realize this at first, but I kept looking at one of the giants. He's apparently he's a small giant, but
yeah,
the Felgenga.
Yeah, the Fjellganger. The Fjellganger. All of the giants are descended from the Jotuns, right? The Jotuns suffered a curse from one of the gods, one of the pantheons of gods, because they lost a war. And with each successive generation, they halve in size. So the current Jotuns, or Ganger, are approximately 3 or 4 times the size of a human. So they're giants, but small giants. There are bigger giants coming in Wave 2.
And they're getting shorter all the time.
No, there are also bigger giants in the game.
Okay. I have a very soft spot in my heart for dwarves and Vikings, so this is an important faction. The one thing that I do have to point out that you didn't mention is that one of the first models that you see is the brewer of Ordron, a bunch of R's in there. But it's a dwarf with a big old axe carrying around a drinking horn with a whole bunch of bottles strapped to his back.
Yeah, he's got a couple of barrels on his back as well as bottles.
Oh, man. Yeah, I can see that. He's standing on a barrel. This guy is going to war right. He's bringing the beer with him. Come on, guys.
So, yeah, his brews have different magical effects. So he's got 3 different magical brews which can buff units and moles. He's a support character.
It's beer. It has magical effects just on its own.
Oh, yes.
All right. So that leaves us with what?
Troglodytes, the 5th faction.
Yep.
Troglodytes are essentially the trolls of Godslayer. Now, Troglodytes represent the elemental race of Shadow. There are 6 elements in the Godslayer universe: air, earth, wind, water, fire, shadow, and darkness. Shadow represents the balancing force of the cosmos. Now, that doesn't make them a passive, nice bunch of guys. The way they balance the different elements is by mass destruction. So if one element gets too big for its boots, they will declare war on that element for a few centuries or millennia and bring it back down to size. Dwarves are, of course, the elemental race of Earth. So, troglodytes, we have firstly the Trolloth. These represent troglodytes who have been in the material plane for a long time. They're very solidly flesh and bone, but still connected to the element of shadow. Now, the design style for the troglodytes is based on Mongols. That's why they all look like Mongols. Pretty much.
Right. Okay. Though there is, I saw these earlier. There was the ones there, Reaver Runts and Skull Smasher Oak Bows.
Yeah. So we got 3 different sub-factions there. We got the Trolloth, Shadow Trolls, and Gnolls. The Trolloth are the standard hardcore melee troops. They've got good armor. They've got a lot of life points, regeneration. They're good in melee, high morale. There's not a lot wrong with them, let's say. They've got a lot of benefits. But they're high point cost as well.
Okay.
All of the Trolloth are large, so they're ogre-sized. They tower over a normal human. And they're on larger bases, of course. Now, they're really one of my favorite sub-factions to play. They got a reasonably tactical style as well, but they are, I would say, the simplest, least complex sub-faction in Godslayer to play. They're straight out melee. And even if you don't use a lot of tactics and strategy, you can still do okay. So it's a really good intro sub-faction to play if somebody's not really tabletop gamer. That's a good one for them to start with.
Okay, just point them in that direction and tell them to charge.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
second sub-faction is the Shadow Trolls. Now these guys represent troglodytes who have recently entered the cosmos during a cosmic cataclysm, and they are more shadowy. So they're partly flesh and bone and partly shadow. They're all have the ethereal ability, so they only take half damage from normal weapons. Then they are also all kind of magical, so they have a lot of magic attacks, and they're quite a hit and run magic sub-faction.
Okay.
Third sub-faction is Gnolls, and this is a horde sub-faction. So the units are large, you can take lots of them, and they're quite rubbish. These are kind of our goblinoid stuff. Action. As long as you got enough characters liberally using their whips, they'll stay and fight. And they have an ability which means they are much better in large groups, and when the unit gets eroded and they take a lot of casualties, then they tend to flee very quickly.
Cowards.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a
really
fun little trait.
Really fun to play, and requiring some tactical finesse. They've also got the Skull Smasher Oak Bows. These are guys who are lying down on their backs, firing massive bows, which have high power impact.
Wait, so these aren't like little brownie type creatures. They aren't smaller than dwarves. Those are actually like full size figures.
They're approximately 25 millimeters tall. The gnolls.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so they are small.
Right. So the image that I have, or the image of them that I'm seeing, has what looks like a 25 or 32 millimeter base, or what I thought was, and they're tiny on it. They look like a grot or something like that with giant bows. It's hilarious.
Right. Okay, the Skull Smasher Oak bows are on large bases. That's why they look small there.
Which makes perfect sense when you say they're 25 millimeter or 28 millimeters tall. It's like they must be on a pretty big base. Yeah. That makes them even more awesome.
Yeah.
I saw these guys earlier and I'm like, I don't know what these are, but there's one of them laying down or two of them laying down on the ground, pulling back arrows on these bows. This is awesome.
Mm-hmm. I love gnolls because I love turning up to a game where the opponent has a warband with like 8 to 12 miniatures, and then I deploy my 50, 60 models on the table. It's you have a morale advantage. I mean, they're all rubbish troops, but you can buff them, and the number of dice rolls you can make makes them terrifying.
Okay, I could see that. I could definitely see that being, the game that should not be named. The certain guard type soldiers that you just take masses of them. They're all rubbish, but altogether they make a big difference.
Yeah. The key with the gnolls is managing their morale issues. So there are countermeasures you can take, putting them close together, keeping the units large, deploying characters to encourage them with their whips. Some adding monsters to the warband also helps. It's not just a simple melee horde. There's definitely strategy to it. So that brings us to the last faction, which is Wild Folk. Wild Folk are based on ancient Celts. They've got 3 sub-factions: Tribal, Fëanor, and Tuathan. So the Tribal sub-faction represents the standard guys of their culture. They live in villages, in woodlands, in swamps, in forests, in the highlands, etc. The first starter box of Wild Folk focus on that subfaction. You've got the Pendragon Warlord and the unit of militia troops called Blade Slingers. Blade Slingers have a weapon which is both a spear and a spear sling. So they can attack in melee, or they can launch missile attacks with it. In general, the Wild Folk are the shootiest faction in the game. That doesn't mean you have to use them only as a shooty faction. You can also play them as a melee faction, or a combination. But they have the most missile troops, and they have the best shooters and the best bows and magical arrows, etc. They also have druids. The tribal subfaction has the druid and the bard, both support characters. And they have the elite Cromlech Guard, who are hard-ass melee troops who are there to defend and protect the druids and the megaliths, which mark out the network of ley lines which cross the landscape. So the Ogham megalith is a model which is also kind of magical support, and it gives protection to the troops around it. That's also part of tribal subfaction. Second subfaction is the Fëanor. These are the best missile troops in the game. You got their elite scouts, but again, like the Mortons, Wildfolk really benefit when you mix the subfactions. So you can have some really fantastic hit and run style warbands with the Wildfolk. For example, one of the rules I hadn't mentioned is that weapon length. Now, most models have a weapon with a range of 1 inch. So typical axe, sword, etc. has a 1 inch range. Spear armed models have a range of 2 inches, which means if I have a unit which is armed with spears and I charge the enemy, I can place my models so that they're 2 inches away from the enemies, which means I can attack them, but they cannot counterattack me. So I can charge in, make an attack, and I can disengage and run away without them attacking back. So they are fantastic hit and run troops. In addition to the missile weapons, of course, they've got a lot of abilities like that allow them to hide and run through difficult terrain. You can set up models with hidden deployment with the Wildfolk. The original box, starter box, is about to be re-released with new sculpts because they were the weakest models actually in the game. So probably next week we'll be releasing the resculpted Blade Slingers, resculpted Pendragon, and Bard.
Okay.
And the new ones look fantastic, I have to say.
Awesome. So yeah, and it looks like for almost everyone in this faction, either they've got a bow or they've got I'm guessing all of these weapons, at least all the two-handed ones that have the 2 inch reach.
The spears have 2 inch reach. The guys with the axes have 1 inch reach.
Okay, so are they still 1 inch?
Yeah, they're big axes, but it's still 1 inch.
Right, they're big axes. So what about the guys with the size? Because there's a few of those. Those guys look pretty mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now this is the third subfaction called the Tuathan. All of the Wildfolk, they're Celtic style, but their fluff from these guys is that they are very close to nature. They live in the wilderlands. They don't really build cities. They like to use the terrain to their advantage. But the Tuathan subfaction are the extremists. These guys actually connect their souls to the force of nature directly, to the anima of nature, which runs through the ley lines and exists in all plant life, etc. So the Tuathan have they represent life in its 3 phases. So birth, growth, and death and decay. The warriors there, those guys are from the death and decay aspect of the Tuathan.
Okay.
Because that's just a natural part of the cycle of nature and life.
Right.
So that's the Wicca warriors, and the Lord of Decay is the warlord for them. So they are very good against undead. That's one of their, because undeath is an abomination against the cycle of life.
Makes definite sense.
Mm-hmm.
And actually puts, because I saw the Lord of Decay and I was like, I see the rest of this line, and that, that just doesn't quite make sense, but it does when you put it in the cycle of life, as you stated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Wave 2 will have models which explore the other aspects of the Tuathan, so life and growth. So it'll have it has the warp warrior, who is like Cuchulainn from Irish mythology. A lot of people know Slain, for example, the comic book Slain. Slain is based on the mythological character Cuchulainn. He warps into this monstrous form.
Okay.
So that's part of the metamorphosis aspect of the Tuathan. Then there'll be kind of more fairy style models for the life and birth aspect of the Tuathan. But anyway, all of them are strongly connected to nature. Even the gods of the Tuathan are worshipping or connected to the force of nature. And in the background of Godslayer, there was one creation goddess who created the entire cosmos, and she was killed by demons who entered the cosmos early on. But she didn't die completely. Parts of her essence soaked into the anima of nature. So the wild folk, especially the Tuathan, their end goal is to reunite these shattered portions of the mother goddess and resurrect her through nature.
That's definitely interesting for the lore.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So one of the things that I did want to come back around to, because I see that every faction has a caster type and stuff like that, and there's a decent amount. You've talked a decent amount about magic, so and I know that you say it's low fantasy, so magic doesn't have a huge primary role in the game. But I'm just wondering how you've balanced that out. You do have these casters and all that,
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of how that works.
Good. So magic falls into several different key elements. One is offensive magic, just blasting the enemies with fireballs, electricity, lightning spells, etc. That's one type. Then you've got debuffing magic, which afflicts enemies with disadvantages. And then you've got buffing kind of magic, which you use to increase the statistics or abilities of your own troops. So each faction has a different focus. The Bane Brood, because their magic is mutation magic in the fluff, they have a lot of spells which can buff their troops. So you can give them long legs, which makes them faster. They can make longer charges. You can give them an exoskeleton to give them extra armor. You can give them bug stalk eyes so they can see better. Or you can give them horrific, monstrous mutations that cause fear and various other different effects. They also have spells which can afflict enemies with mutations which cripple them. So that's the Bane Brood's magic. Second is the Halodines. They've got the strongest magic in the game. Their magic is very offensive. They got lightning bolt spell, which you cast it on one model in an enemy unit, and it can jump from model to model and cause damage on most of the unit. They've got a lot of buffing spells as well, and some debuff as well. So they're the strongest. They've got a really diverse amount of spells, and you can tailor their magic very well. And they're really good at casting. They got better range. They can take more spells. They can sustain more spells in play. Then Mortons, the focus of their magic is necromancy. So that's raising the undead, making them more effective. But their necromancers are also useful for living troops because they have a variety of standard buffing spells to improve melee skills and strength, things like that. But yeah, their focus is on undead. The Nordgard, they don't have any spellcasters at the moment, but they have a lot of magical weapons.
And they have beer, so I mean they don't.
And they have beer.
Really...
They have magical beer. What could be better than that?
Not much. Actually, I don't think anything.
The Troglodytes, they're a very magical faction. The Shadow Trolls, especially, they have a lot of buffing spells, and it makes them kind of tricky, increasing their speed, increasing their range, making them a bit more hit and run. And they have a lot of magical attacks as well, just straight out long range magical attacks. Then the wild folk have more subtle kind of magic, which is very strategic. That's about all I can say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So the magic is different for each faction, and it's really based on the fluff of the faction.
Right, definitely. And, that's nice because it does create a lot more character for it. It fits in line with their belief systems and stuff like that, and it is a nice thing to have.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But okay. So there was one thing we were talking about before the show. I don't know if you want to take a few minutes to dive into that or not. I know you said you hadn't really announced it yet, so
yeah. Well, it's common knowledge already. We are planning on a Kickstarter, and this is for the release of Wave 2. Godslayer started about 4 years ago, and we were just a couple of guys with no money and a big dream. And when you've got no money, it makes it kind of difficult to launch a game.
Yes.
So it's been a slow development. A lot of players won't buy into a game unless there's a lot of models. And you can't make a lot of models unless you have a lot of people buying your stuff and paying you money for it. So it's a really chicken and egg situation when you release a game. It's a struggle to get the money to produce enough models to keep people happy and attract more players so that you can make more money and keep the cycle running. And so far, we haven't hit the point where it's self-perpetuating. It doesn't pay for itself at all. And it's a long-term investment. But we've reached a point now where we've released all the models from Wave 1, and we will be releasing a starter box for each faction for Wave 2. And we've got a lot of stuff already sculpted for that, and the next models to follow on from that. So now we have really a lot of models available, and it's the right time to relaunch the game. So it never had a fanfare. It never had a proper release. It was just scratching around and trying to build something from nothing when we started. So this is a good point to do a proper release, and that's what we're going to do through Kickstarter, probably in February next year. And this will be both Wave 2 starter boxes and also a battle box. So this is something for new players and for existing players. The battle box will have the rulebook, a 110-page rulebook, and 2 substantial warbands. So that will be Halidines and Banebrood. It will have, each one has a warlord, a character, a creature, 2 characters, in fact, a creature, and a full unit. So it's going to be something like 14 models per side, and that'll be about 300 to 350 points, which is a standard warband size in Godslayer for a typical short game, let's say, a 1 to 2 hour game. So that's going to be a fantastic way for new players to get into the game. Awesome. And it's going to really, I think, be attractive to a lot of new players because we've got now a substantial amount of miniatures for people to get started with. I mean, once the Wave 2 starter boxes are released, there'll be 5 units, 4 or 5 warlords, a whole bunch of characters, and several monsters available for every faction.
All right.
That's the plan. So February, big release. There'll also be a lot of stretch goals with mercenary models, which can be used by any faction. A lot of exclusive profile cards, item cards, spell cards, some avatar models, which are really high power models for larger games, and a whole bunch of cool stuff. So we're planning this to be a really big Kickstarter.
Right. And so you're, like you were just talking about with the Wild Folk, you are still even releasing new and updated stuff before the Kickstarter for the game. And so all of this is been self-funded up till now? Yeah.
It's essentially self-funded. The Megalith Games was started by myself and a friend of mine. And we built the company and the game together. We developed everything together. He has since decided to focus on his another company, and so he left Megalith Games, and he's working on board games now.
Okay.
So it was essentially us, the two of us, building it up and investing in it ourselves. Now, of course, all of the money which has come in over the last 4 years has been immediately directly channeled into creating new miniatures. So yeah, every person that's bought anything in Godslayer over the last 4 years has been very helpful. creating the future of the game.
That's pretty common, especially with self-funded games like that. That any money that you make just goes right back into it.
Mm-hmm. I'm dreaming that one day it might be profitable. but the next step is that we need to pass that point where it's self-perpetuating, where it funds itself, so that we have enough capital and enough income coming in so that we can constantly produce new releases at a rate that players demand.
Yeah.
That is the next step that we have to hit. And we're hoping that the Kickstarter is actually going to move us to that point.
That's definitely a good goal. Are you going to, that might be a little bit early, but are you going to have retailer pledges available?
Yeah, there will be a retailer pledge.
That's good, because that is definitely something that's kind of essential in the Kickstarter industry at the moment. When you go, it's, unless there certain plans or feasibilities that limit it. It's folks definitely like it better when there's a retailer pledge, and I know if enough folks in my local gaming community express interest, our local gaming store does go out and backs it, and then sets it up with people to get their pre-orders in and get the game when it releases.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of games out there, a lot of great games, in fact, a lot of cool games. So Godslayer has a lot. It's got stiff competition, but I think the rule system is fantastic. The models are nice, most of them, and they're getting better all the time. The fluff is really great. It's an amazingly detailed world, which really feels authentic. But the best thing about the game is the rule system, I would say, because it's so playable and so realistic and so fun. It's just an action-packed drama every time you play it. I mean, even although, I'm co-creator of the game, it's honestly the best rules system I've ever played.
Bias aside, that is always a nice feeling when you look at it and you're like, yes, this definitely truly is good. When you're objective about it.
Mm-hmm. So you've got the action token system, as I mentioned before, allows tremendous flexibility and realism. So you have no artificial phases in the game where you have to move now and then you do your attacks next and you do your spells next. That's just nonsense. In Godslayer, you can do anything in any order. And that makes it much more realistic, much more tactical and flexible. Then you've got the 2d6 system, which is ideal for a skirmish game. And on top of that, you've got the turnaround activations, which keeps the game constantly interesting for both players and tactically challenging. Additionally to that, you can equip warlords with different weapons, different armor, magical items. So every time you take your warlord, it's the same warlord, but you can make it slightly different in every game by just taking different equipment. That's
awesome.
Yeah, so that's something which is really cool about Godslayer too. Yeah, and it's incredibly well balanced. You see, before we even released it, and we started this about 8 years ago, And it had 4 years of playtesting before we even released the first rulebook. And it was extensively playtested by a group of fanatics who I will be eternally thankful to. And so it's incredibly well balanced, both the core rules and the factions.
Okay. Well, that is drawing us to the conclusion. Actually, we've gone a bit long in the tooth on this episode, which is quite all right. We don't have Tim telling us he has to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But I want to say thank you. I want to give you a minute to tell the listeners where they can find you out there on the internet.
Yeah. So, megalith-games.com. There you will find the shop with all the models to buy. You can also download the rules for free, both the core rules and quick start rules. There's also tons of background information about the game and the models. You can even download the profile cards. So if you don't want to invest any money now, just download the cards, download the rules, and proxy a few games. I'm sure you'll be impressed, and I'm sure you'll come back and buy into the system. So, megalith-games.com.
All right. Any social media, Twitter, Facebook, or anything like that? Facebook groups that people can join?
Yeah, we're also on Facebook. Yeah. Just
okay.
Search for Megalith Games or Godslayer.
Awesome. All right. So, once again, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Yeah, the pleasure's all mine. So, be glad to talk to you again. Maybe after the Kickstarter release.
Yeah, definitely. We would love to have you back on.
Cool.
All right. Well, folks, you have a good night.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Skirmish Supremacy. To see more of the antics that Nick and I do, you can check us out on Facebook at Skirmish Supremacy. We also have Twitter, which we can be reached at Skirmish Supreme, because apparently Skirmish Supremacy does not fit in Twitter. And if you want to email us directly, you can reach us at tim@skirmishsupremacy.com or nick@skirmishsupremacy.com. Thanks for listening.